press the bell icon on the YouTube app to never miss a video from Newslaundry.
Hello and welcome to Newslaundry Interviews. Today we have with us journalist and author P Sainath. He's worked with the Times of India. He was rural affairs editor at The Hindu. He's most known for covering agrarian distress and farmer suicide, and he's currently founding editor of PARI, which is People's Archive of Rural India. It's a platform that seeks to archive and document stories and reports from rural India. Now, for the purpose of this conversation, I wanted us to focus on media and the role of media in reporting on migrant crisis and labor issues. So I wanted to begin with asking you, Mr. Sainath. First question was, how have you seen the labor beat change in India in mainstream news from the time that, say, when you joined mainstream media back in the 80s to now? Does it even exist?
Change, it simply died. When the first year I joined journalism, and that is late 1980, almost every newspaper had a full-time correspondent on the labor beat or the employment beat. It had a full-time correspondent. Even in the agencies we had, I joined UNI in late 80, we had people who gave a lot of attention to that beat. Though in an agency, you do multiple things, as you know. Yet, from the mid-80s, the idea of that beat started diminishing very rapidly. As of today, I do not know a single newspaper or a single television channel which has a full-time correspondent on that beat. Alongside it is the so-called agriculture correspondent beat, which once upon a time used to be about farming. In the big newspapers in the 60s, 70s, when you joined, you were packed off to a small town in a district somewhere, and you worked your way up, getting to know the mandi, the farmer, the seasons, the harvesting, the sowing part. You actually covered farming. You actually engaged with agriculture. Today, the agriculture correspondent is someone who covers the agriculture ministry and agribusiness. In the last 10 years, it's become increasingly covering agribusiness. Very often, covering
commodities.
Very often, not just that, not just the commodities, but also very large conglomerates and corporations like, say, Monsanto, and seed companies which have a disproportionate influence on policy and are able to use the media to promote themselves and spread absolute nonsense about the viability of certain technologies. So you have then the agricultural correspondent there was a period when covering the agriculture ministry was reduced to, say, covering the agriculture minister. So all you did was to follow Sharad Pawar around and do your thing. Today, most Indians would be very hard put to name the agriculture minister.
Even the BJP spokesperson couldn't recently.
Yes.
But this is true for a lot of beats, even with politics. It's reduced to covering the minister.
Manisha, it's not so exactly. Remember this, the other beats, the politics beats exist. The largest number of...
That's what I was coming to. Yeah.
In the largest number of correspondents on any sectors are business number one and politics number two. But when you do not have a labor correspondent and you do not have a farming correspondent, we are making a statement that 75% of the population don't matter, do not make news, except in election year. Now, just take a simple fact about labor. If we look right through, say, from the past decade, 2010 onwards, or 2001 to 2010, whichever decade you please, you'd find that the average number of people at the employment exchanges was in the region of 40 million, which would make it one of the bigger countries in the world in population terms. Okay, but one of the big countries, not bigger, but yeah. Now, just visualize this for a moment. Those 40 million do not represent your unemployed, they're job seekers. Okay? A heck of a lot of people don't go to the employment exchanges. But just suppose you took those 40 million people and stood them in one line, tightly packed, my nose in the guy's collar in front of me. You'd fit maximum 2 people in 1 meter. You know what that length of that queue would be? It would be 3.5 times your coastline of mainland India. Yeah, because your coastline is 6,087 kilometers. I'm not counting the islands. Even if you did count the islands, that would be another seven. It would be 7,000, 7,500 kilometers. But mainland India has a coastline of less than 6,100 kilometers. Now that queue, 2 to a meter, 2,000 to a kilometer, you're going to get a, what? How many kilometers long will that queue be? It'll be 3.5 times the size of your coastline. Surely that is news. Surely that is compelling to be covered. We don't give a damn. And then in farming, there are also the farm workers who are a much larger number than farmers. In fact, people have a very mistaken idea of how many farmers there are in this country. And it shows, the ignorance shows because the media are ignorant and do not have anyone covering these issues. So you're talking about two vital, crucial issues for understanding this thing. On the media, it showed you that up to March 25th, you have no mention of this creature called migrant labor. From March 26th, we are totally focused on that to the exclusion of every other branch of labor. Now, if Newslaundry, I would urge Newslaundry, since you do a lot of media analysis, content analysis, go back and take a 10-year sweep, 2011 to 2020, from the census onwards, the next 10 years. Have a look, pick on 3 major national television channels or 6 major national newspapers, which means coming out of Delhi, and see how many half-hour discussions or panels you had on the subject of migrant labor. How many times did you even mention the word migrant labor? How many op-eds were there debating between one economist and the other about the issues of, I think you'll find zilch.
I think on television you wouldn't find a single debate.
Yeah.
I think it'd be hard to find a debate. And yeah, even with newspapers, you could say that, you wouldn't, at least agriculture still, I think, finds a little bit of space, but migrant labor or labor crisis or labor issues rarely find that kind of space. And that comes to the point of that you were making earlier, the labor beat.
Agriculture finds a little space because agriculture demands, gives you a little reality therapy to the media. Look, it took 7 years. It took 7, and one of those guys who gave agriculture space in the mainstream media, if you'll forgive my saying so, was myself. It took 7 years to make the farm suicides a national issue. It took 7 years. And much of the coverage was also much of the editorial op-ed page coverage was of a very dismissive nature. And your migrant crisis of today is very much related to that agrarian distress. It came out of it.
And I think even in television, even with reporting on the current migrant crisis, for the past 2 months, we have had debates and television news focus, but it only becomes news when it's an AAP government versus the opposition, or it's a UP government. It's even that is politicized. It's not really telling us what's happening.
That's right.
And so, leading from the first question of the labor beat dying, why do you think that happened? And do you think that had something to do with the media itself moving towards contractual employment? Do you see a parallel there with how journalism as an industry or media as an industry itself has shaped itself?
Contractual employment was the mechanism, the process. It was the mechanism by which certain things were achieved. Okay? Contractual employment was part of a process. That process was and is corporatization of the media, which picks up enormously from the 80s. It begins from the late 70s. It picks up enormously from the mid 80s. Now, what contract did was to completely kill the independence of the journalists. It wiped out also the journalist unions, which were the best guarantee of my freedom and yours. If I could do the things that I did in Blitz, writing, I wasn't, by the way, ever an employee of the Times of India. I was a Times of India fellow. I worked in agencies, newspapers, dailies, and the digital space. If you had, my generation had this luck. If I was victimized, there were thousands of journalists across the country organized in unions who would come to my rescue. The current generation of journalists has no such fallback. The unions were completely destroyed by the 11-month contract. Yeah? And which, by the way, is a violation of national laws. It has not been tested in court. It's a very sad thing. But when you have a Working Journalists Act, how on earth do you have the contract system? It's very, very dubious in law. Second, when you, I don't know if you remember it or are aware of it, but in 2009, on the front page of the Hindu, we broke the first large-scale investigation into paid news in this country.
Yes.
Right? Now, I could do that because I was still employed under the Working Journalists Act on a wage board salary, on a paper at that time which was still hiring people under that under adherence to the wage board and the Working Journalists Act. Except for one other newspaper, others could not do this, right? Because they were being compelled. You are in the, as one of the senior most Marathi journalists told me, when you're in the 8th month of your 11-month contract, and the boss calls you and tells you, here is an interview with a senior cabinet minister, it's been done by his own PR agency, it'll go with your name. He said, you've got a mother in hospital, you've got one kid looking for a job, another trying to get a huge education loan, you're paying EMIs on that education loan, on the housing loan, on the vehicle loan. You want me to be a hero? He put his name on it, though he's a person of enormous integrity, and never, ever did I doubt it, or even today do not doubt that he made nothing out of that interview. Yeah? So you had the contract system reduced you to kind of bonded labor of the, you could be cast away at will. Yeah? And this is what they all campaign for to be done in the rest of industry. Consider the last 1 month. At a time when the people need you, need journalists, need journalism more than ever before in living memory, yeah, this generation, at that time, we've laid off over 1,000 journalists. The Hindustan Times alone has had 2 rounds of bloodletting, which are over 27% of their staff.
Yeah.
They
had about 150 the first time, and I think about 30 people is what I heard recently.
So that would bring it to 28% of their staff. The Vikatan in Tamil Nadu, 175 at one shot. The Times moves in very clever ways, and a lot of them don't sack you. They make you resign. Why will your reporting of migrants be in any way well-informed? You're throwing away the guys who could do it. You're throwing away the people who could do that reporting for you, who have the knowledge at the desk to ask the reporter the right question.
So I want to, 2 things. One question I want to ask, you said you were with the wage board at Hindu. Have you always been a wage board employee, or have you chosen, have you always chosen wage board over contract? I
always chose wage board over contract. See, the wage board.
Why so? Because, there's also this other thinking that with the wage board, you can't, if you really want to rise up fast, if you want your salaries to be this amount, it's just better to take a contract over.
Well,
that's what a newcomer, when you join journalism, you're told that, wage board is secure and safe, but you won't have the opportunity to rise in terms of income in the way you can with contract.
Yeah.
So I'm just trying to understand why.
It's a choice. One, you're making a choice. See, it's like if you're a freelancer, you're making a choice between freedom and security. Okay, you're going to have to fight for every inch of space that you get. You're going to have to struggle for that. The thing about wage board is, first of all, it was the law, and I believe in the wage. I believe in the Working Journalists Act. Primarily, always worked under that employment terms, which come and the rules and the obligations of the Working Journalists Act. Was I always? No, I was 13 years a freelancer. So it really didn't matter. But I've been 40 years in journalism, so it matters at another level. Incidentally, the wage board doesn't say that you're pegged to low salaries. It doesn't say that. It pegs you at a minimum for that. I can give you more than that if I choose to. But I will give you that only if you switch to contract.
That's how it actually phased out of newsrooms, literally.
Yes.
Where when you joined a newsroom, you were told. Essentially, you were not told, but that was the implication of being a wage.
You know what the Times of India did to people who chose and clung on to the wage board? It put them in a separate cabin and once had a board outside saying surplus staff. Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, it did that.
Wow.
Surplus staff, which was to humiliate, strip them of any dignity. You can imagine the impact it had on those few people who clung on to that, who refused to switch to contract. I have to say that I was extremely lucky. When I worked in the news agency, I was lucky. When I worked in the Blitz group thing, I was extremely lucky. There was a wage board always. When I worked in the Hindu, there was Working Journalists Act and wage board. In my last 2-3 years in the Hindu, all our wages went up. But it means that, say, 27, out of 35 years in mainstream or corporate media, all but 3 years were of a very standard wage board salary. But it meant a lot to me because I had a paper that, in all 3 cases, I had an organization that respected the Working Journalists Act, at least at that time.
So you were talking about layoffs, and I think I've been a journalist for now 10 years, and I think I haven't seen the kind of, at Newslaundry at least, the kind of calls and the kind of mails and the kind of information that we're getting from across the country. It's really heartbreaking. We've had journalists laid off in Times of India, in Economic Times, in Hindustan Times, ABP, Telegraph. We've had Sakal Times shut down. You mentioned Wickerton firing, and I don't even know what's happening in smaller states and local news. I mean, I'm sure with the advertisements being hit during the lockdown, they would have taken a big hit. And there are 2 things that strike me. One is the opacity of it. Often when we spoke to employees, they just didn't know what was happening in their company. They didn't know who was being laid out, how many people. They didn't know if this is the only spate of firing or if there's going to be more firings. So consequently, you're constantly living in this fear that you don't know if you could be next. And the second bit was post-resignation bits, and where you were asked to resign. You weren't really, laid off with a severance package or with a medical insurance. And by the way, companies have done that, like Zomato and Swiggy. Why do you think, there's so much opacity around it, and specifically with the media? There's simply an refusal to come on record to speak about what's happening to their employees.
This is the great media's right to know, right? Right to information.
Yeah, it's amazing that journalists questioning politicians every day don't know.
Those who present the media corporations that, if anything is done to their advertising or anything else, make it an issue of freedom of expression and freedom of press, are ruthlessly, just scatter journalists like confetti and get away with it and coerce them into silence in a code of omerta, right? Now, why does that happen? I think that's incredibly simple. I don't think that's a question at all. I said that the big process which has transformed the media in the last 28, 30, in the last 35 years is the corporatization. Now, a corporation which has 1,000 other interests, like Reliance Corporation or many others, when they acquire newspaper, the attitude from 85, the singular achievement of Mr. Samir Jain was to reduce journalism to just another revenue stream. Okay. Now, what they are doing to us, and we are very scandalized and angered by it, they've been doing to employees in other units owned by them, non-journalism, non-media corporations. They've been doing that for 30 years, and we have covered them favorably. Many of the media companies are not going to criticize what's happening in another because they are doing it themselves. In the paid news scandal, 2 newspapers in the English spectrum, 2, spoke up about it because the rest were indulging in it. Okay? They could not say anything. They even withdrew stories sometimes which their reporters brought. Now, from the 80s, I've made a clear distinction between media and journalism. Mr. Jain said, Samir Jain said, media is a business like any other business. Mr. Vineet Jain told the New Yorker, we are not in the newspaper business, we are in the advertising business. So they are very clear on what they are and who they are. You know, if you reduce journalism to a revenue stream, as a corporation has to, yeah, because it's got to show more bang for the buck on each buck for the shareholder, then your entire orientation, your milieu, your ethos changes from what media and newspapers were for 170 years almost in this country. So that is not a surprise at all. It's shocking, but you shouldn't. I mean, I think the injured innocence with which we view what's happening, please look at Tata Steel in Jamshedpur. Look at Bajaj Auto. Just look at how many people they had in 1991. Their productivity goes up, but the labor force falls tremendously because of technology and of drawing more out of fewer people, which has led to the kind of conditions you see labor in now. So please don't make this distinction. It's a very, very spurious distinction between our media. Worse, I would say the media are incredibly more hypocritical about it because they're carrying lectures every day about better conditions and, we must all our hearts bleed for the migrant laborer. In the same way, Manisha, we are making distinctions, spurious distinctions between migrant laborers and other laborers. The other laborers in our city, those unions whom everybody hates, they are migrant laborers of another generation. They are also migrant laborers. Many of those who live on in Mumbai, their grandparents or great-grandparents were migrants 3-4 generations ago. Now, the other thing is this, that what corporations do is to standardize the product. Corporations homogenize and they don't want geniuses. They want executives who fulfill what their product idea is. They homogenize, they standardize. When you do that, you completely lack expertise in anything except the 2 or 3 things that matter to you.
Which is what's happening in television.
Yeah, well, it's also what happens. It also, like say when you have a stock exchange collapse in Dalal Street, the business editor of every major publication from Delhi and channel from Delhi is in Mumbai in the next 2 hours along with the finance minister. It matters to them. If 315,000 farmers committed suicide between 95 and in the next 20 years, how many correspondents did we put on that beat? How many did the agriculture minister, to my knowledge, never visited a single farm household? They're not important to them.
So just to follow up on the layoffs, do you believe that forced resignations that journalists are being asked to go through can be challenged in court?
I believe that the whole contract system can be challenged in court. You see, it's like this. There is a constitution of India. Independently of that, can I contract someone to be my slave? Look, I'm saying, oh, it's a contract. He signed it willingly. But does it have a legal basis? Your slavery is not permitted in your constitution. And by the way, that's why, please note that long before COVID, I think there are 2 points you have to understand about that. All of us have to understand about the layoffs. One, the layoffs were going on long before COVID. COVID gives people an opportunity. Look, those who are dumping the largest number of people are amongst the most profitable media companies in the world. Okay? Their profit margins, their ability to make money is the envy of the Sensex top 30. Okay? That kind of margins they have. Your media and entertainment industry, because it is one industry, not to be split into two, in March 2019 was worth 2 trillion rupees. What's that? 26, 27 billion dollars. And a handful of companies make profits that other corporations cannot dream of. Now, when you're in that kind of situation, it is actually much smaller guys who are holding on to their employees, telling them, no, we are not going to throw you, under the bus. Yes. Guys who can afford to look after their employees are the first to make them walk the plank. This is one thing that needs to be done. Second, look at pre-COVID. Every major crisis has been an occasion to dump people. 2008 was the Wall Street collapse, September, October. I covered it from the United States. At the time I was teaching at Berkeley. And you had, in India, you had company after company after company, media company, insisting that India was not suffering any recession. Prudent fiscal management had saved us. Nothing of the sort. The bank union saved you by not allowing you to bring your banks into the kind of system that the American banks were. They saved our skins. Mr. Chidambaram took credit for it. Prudent fiscal management. Had you gone with the kind of Narasimhan committee reforms that they wanted, your banks wouldn't be in existence today. Third, in 2009, till 2009, the newspapers, the hypocrisy of it, were insisting that the Indian economy, I remember one Times headline, zooms back with I don't know how many O's in the zooms. And at the same time, each corporation was dropping 150 journalists to 200 journalists. Same, Sakal, the usual suspects, Times of India. You remember the very large demonstrations of journalists outside CNN, IBN at that time. So it happened after the Wall Street collapse. It happened after demonetization. It was happening in between. Please go and look at last year how many journalists were laid off. But a crisis, a conjuncture like that, it gives them an excuse to dump them in busloads. Okay, that is the thing that it gave them. Is there a problem for many papers to pay? Yes, there are much smaller publications, as you said, the regional ones which are dependent on government advertising. Yeah, they have a problem. Yet I find that some of them are trying.
Even if you look at in the English dailies, the Indian Express, which is relatively smaller in terms that they don't have other business interests like Times or HT, have effected salary cuts, but they haven't done layoffs.
Yeah.
And salary cuts with the CEO taking a zero salary, with the editor-in-chief saying, okay, we're not going to take a salary. So it's true even if you look at the Delhi newspapers.
That's right.
And in fact, you think that the Times would be able to tide through for at least the next 6-7 months, but they've been the first to sort of Times and H to ruthlessly sort of get rid of people.
That's right. Can I suggest that in fact, this is a period when newspapers ought to be hiring a few journalists, okay? Because you're trying to cover things you have no clue about. Now, just tell me which of those panel discussions that you've seen show on the part of the panelists any knowledge of how many migrants there are in the country, how many are interstate, how many are long-range migrants, how many are footloose migrants, what are the categories of migration, whether it is seasonal migration, long-range migration, long-term migration, and the most vulnerable group of migrant laborers, You don't find it being mentioned except by guys like me when we go on there, called footloose migrants. They are the fastest growing group in the last 2 decades. They are people who have no clear final destination. They might get, maybe they will get 20 days going from Kalahandi to Raipur to pull rickshaws in the tourist season. Maybe they'll get 100 days in the brick kilns of Vizianagaram, or 40 days on a construction site in maybe in Mumbai. The operative word is maybe.
And you're saying that's the largest chunk now?
I'm saying you don't
people
know,
that you see?
it was for me the fastest growing, because Manisha, of the quarter century that I have spent full time as a rural reporter, out of the 250, 270 days I spend each year in the countryside, I always kept 40 to 60 days for traveling with migrants. Please look at the Hindu. You will find reports from me, the bus to Mumbai, from Mehboob Nagar to Mumbai. In 1993, when I did that journey, there was one bus a week from Telangana's Mehboob Nagar district. One bus a week, one bus service a week. Yeah. In 2003, I did the same trip. In May 2003, there were 43 to 45 bus services a week. What does that tell you? And the revenue collection was mainly 85% one way, unidirectional to Mumbai. Please know that all this was known and going on, but you can't, and you and I can't count footloose migrants. And the NSS and the census are not geared towards capturing the movements of short-term migrants, circular migrants, or footloose migrants. But we know that their numbers have grown from the kinds of evidentiary sources that I have told you. So you've had something gigantically growing. Suddenly, you're asked to cover, it's like suddenly. Let me also make one thing very clear. There are hundreds and hundreds of journalists in this country who are perfectly capable of covering it. There are hundreds of journalists in these very corporate media who are extremely competent to cover it. They don't ever get that opportunity. So suddenly when something happens, you're having someone who doesn't know his ass from his elbow out there in the field, emoting with a camera and a mic.
Yeah. So I think that's what I wanted to come to you, that there's this one problem of ignoring the labor beat, and as a result of which we saw the coverage of the migrant crisis, the most recent migrant crisis, which I personally think, I do think that this being the first migrant crisis, maybe in the times of social media, you had instances where social media viral videos pushed journalists to take note. There was people on TikTok putting up videos of, of maybe a girl taking a father, cycling, him back to Bihar and stuff like that. So I do think social media here did put a little bit of pressure on mainstream media, at least television media, to take note. But anyway, there were two aspects to it. I thought that one was the television media, which was denying it, the same sort of political blame game. Oh, there's no problem, the government's handling everything, don't question the government sort of narrative. And then you have the other narrative, which is sort of, it gives you one sob story after the other. After a point, after which it's just another sob story. You get my point? It's sort of as a consumer, you're just hit with, okay, sad story, person lost his father, person died of starvation, another sad person, another sad story.
Again.
But you're not really hit with what's happening.
Yeah, because.
And you don't come out of it informed.
It brings you, yes.
Good intention, but it doesn't really inform you.
It brings you to very fundamental issues of journalism and what has happened. Yeah, that's right. What you've said is right. However, I'm saying, see, the idea that the first migrant crisis in the period of social media, I would be cautious in making that assertion. The migrant crisis, because we are seeing the migrant crisis as a crisis where the migrants are leaving the cities and going back to the countryside. The real question for a journalist who believes in asking why, is for you to ask, why did they leave the villages in the first place and come here? That's one question to ask. If you ask that question, and that process was happening very much in the era of social media as well, when millions of people, do you know that your 2011 census was unique in your country's history? Since 1921, there has never been a census which showed you that for the first time, urban India added more human beings than rural India. Urban India added 91 million. Rural India added 90 million. Now just go back 10 years to 2001. Urban India added 68 million and rural India added 113 million. 45 million more people than urban India. Now please note that growth rates of population were falling, plummeting. Growth rates of family size were coming down. Growth rates of family size in rural India, though the fall of growth rate of population is greater in rural India, the growth rate of family size, the rate of fall was greater, but not the size. But the family size in rural India remains bigger than family size in urban India. And yet, urban India added more people. That should have told anyone with half an eye that some gigantic migrations were on. But we were not interested. We were interested in 9% growth and watching the Sensex cross 20,000. Okay, it's as long as what the process that came in brought migrants into the towns, as long as that was favoring us, benefiting us, your dhobi, my plumber, and the factories, it didn't really worry us or disturb our compassion or our conscience. It's when, now we are full of compassion because there's an old saying, when the poor become literate, the rich lose their palanquin bearers. We've lost our palanquin bearers. Okay? And believe me, when the situation stabilizes, compassion has this annoying habit of evaporating when comfort returns. Malnutrition deaths in children, which was the point at which I decided to leave my job in 91. When 29 children in Mokhada, Thane died of, malnourishment, starvation, ill health, malnourishment-related diseases. We made a hell of a lot more noise than we would today, okay? 91, the media was still slightly different. Some of us got prizes for covering that and the negligence and failure of government. Two differences. One, I felt thoroughly ashamed. I felt it was a hypocrisy. I didn't touch the awards that were offered to me because those children didn't die in one day. There was a process leading to it, which was the process of the new economic reforms, destroying the public distribution system, destroying their access to proper rations. Had we covered that process, the kids might have been alive. That's the difference between covering the event and covering the process. You get the prizes for covering the event. And a lot of journalism is orientated towards that. Third is that when you have absolutely, you're operating in a little sandbox. You can do human interest stories and bleeding heart stories. You can't question larger economic policy. That is blasphemy. That is heresy. If you do that, then you will if you start doing that, you'll understand. The question is, why did they leave their villages in the first place? We destroyed the livelihoods over 20, 30 years. We completely smashed all the agrarian livelihoods there. Now these people are going back to livelihoods that are not there. The other difference between 91 and now, in 91, newspapers still questioned the Prime Minister. Today, your Prime Minister has made 5 speeches to the nation between mid-March and end May. Okay? Now, we are saying the media are talking about migrant laborers and the hardship. In the first 4 of those 5 speeches, Mr. Modi did not mention the word migrant laborers, not even once. Go check. Okay? In the 5th speech, he mentions migrant laborers once and laborers 3-4 times. Right? So this is, again, it shows you where we really stand in terms of the... Now, couldn't the media have questioned that? Oh, no chance. No chance. People want to keep their jobs, right? I would. If I had a job in the mainstream media, I'd be much more cautious, right? So you have a thing. You've built up a cult of personality on a scale that never existed before in independent India. Look at the fact. You're not questioning the larger processes that are underway. Forget the migrant laborer. Forget the other parts of it. look at the fact that legislatures and parliament are simply at zero functioning in your country, where we are the great IT superpower, we are the slick software guys, but the United Kingdom, Britain's parliament is meeting regularly. Its committees meet physically, and there are e-meetings of parliament in many European countries, but not in India. No parliament session is called by the President of India at a time of grave national crisis, when it is the President who can do that. There are many people who don't know the name of the President of India. 3, your cabinet doesn't function. It's suddenly called together for a media op, but only one minister, only 2 ministers, but one was very silent, surprisingly for him. Mr. Shah said very little during the crisis. The one minister who could say things publicly was the finance minister, who was emoting from scripts that she read and did not understand, and everybody in the media world knew that she had no clue what she was talking about. All other ministers and cabinet government doesn't function. You have, when it came to the crisis of migrant trains, a junior health ministry official was answering questions of journalists. Where are the secretaries of government? There is no administration visible. There is no government, no cabinet, no parliament, no legislatures. One gentleman addresses the country every 2-3 weeks on a reality show and tells us what to do.
Okay, so my last question is on PARI. You've been running this archive, and PARI's also been reporting. You've also written an extensive piece on how to deal with the lockdown and what could be done to ease it for the poorest, the weakest section. I want to know, what are you hearing from your various correspondents, from various people that are writing for your website on the lockdown? Like, what sort of insights can we get on how has it really impacted?
There are at least 3 aspects to it. First is, we didn't discover migrants on March 26th. We cover them around the year, 5 years that we have existed. The largest single section in PARI, the People's Archive of Rural India, the largest single section is called the Rural in the Urban. What does that mean? It means migrants. Second, most of our PARI people are familiar with the agrarian crisis. They see the links. So they know that those in the cities or those in the towns are not the only migrants. Do you realize that there hasn't been a word said in the major media about rural to rural migrants? We are much more concerned. 90% of our focus is on city going back to village. Rural to rural migrants can number tens of millions. They are people from one village who will go to another village, another district, another state. For that, getting 30 days of work in the harvest season, 20 days of work, loading, unloading, etc., and can go back. They were stuck this time and stymied completely. They're in very grave distress. The third is, we approach it in 3-4 ways. One, our motto, our slogan is the everyday lives of everyday people. You cannot understand migrants and the crisis beginning March 26th. If you know what their everyday lives were. So our correspondents are reporting what we all know to be true of the countryside in PARI. And I covered the countryside, I have covered and still cover the countryside full time for more than a quarter of a century. We have our networks. A lot of our correspondents are based in places, Chhattisgarh, Damtari, in interesting places where things are happening in Telangana. And we have a very large volunteer base who are concerned and moved by the issue, not by the TRP. They are telling us that don't think it's only the migrant in trouble. The migrants' families back home, their kin, are in serious trouble. The migrants have stopped sending remittances. Now they're coming back to people who were dependent on those remittances, and they are also going to be adding to the pressure on the family, which has no money. Third, or fourth rather, it is not just the migrants. The nature of what we did in the last 30 years As I said, we scrapped millions of livelihoods and the rest were made incredibly vulnerable. An incredible part of your mainstream, I like that word, mainstream media. It excludes the mainstream from its content but calls itself mainstream. Most of them have no idea. You find them talking about, say, 50 to 60% of the country are farmers. They're not. Actually, farmers are far fewer than you might think. Agrarian is not the same thing as agricultural. Many of our editors don't understand this. The number of farmers in your country, full-time farmers, is less than 8% of the population.
8% figure from the census.
Yeah, that's the main cultivator. Second, marginal cultivators, if you include it, goes up to about 9.5, 9.9%. Then come agricultural laborers. If you add all these categories together, you come to 24%, 22, 24%. Then come all the allied occupations. All those who are not cultivators, not agricultural laborers necessarily, but who are dependent, whose occupations are dependent on farmers and agriculture as the market. Weavers, carpenters, potters, spinners, all of them are dependent. This is your agrarian, larger agrarian society. The 24% plus this 24, 25%. Not many people are aware that handlooms and handicrafts are the second biggest employer in your country after agriculture, Manisha, not IT. Now, weavers are starving. That's what our correspondents are telling us. Okay, the weavers of the Chirala sari. Chirala is a district, Chirala is a town in Andhra Pradesh. The word Chirala is derived, in my opinion, from Chira, which means sari. The Kanjivaram sari makers, weavers, they're on the edge. They're on the edge. Many other weavers in Rajasthan are on the doorstep of starvation.
And that's going to be sustained because we don't know when they'll have access to market or when there will be even a demand for handicrafts. I mean,
not only demand,
could really mean
not only lack of demand, but existing orders worth hundreds of crores were cancelled, right? From Delhi Heart, from where they make the maximum money each year, those were cancelled. Then what about fishermen? When you have a 2-month ban on fishing, which is a very correct thing each year, and the fishermen know and understand that, it means the 2 weeks before the ban will be the peak period of fishing, correct? Those 2 weeks came under the lockdown. And then you have the propaganda offensive. Fishermen are finding that they're telling us that when they're trying to sell their fish, people are telling them on the East Coast, hey, these have come from China. They're infected with coronavirus. Yeah. Well, you have how many million WhatsApp messages have you seen blaming Islamic conspiracies in China for the coronavirus? It's not surprising to me that a certain number of people have fears over this, given that their WhatsApp messages have come to them from friends they know, it's been passed on, etc. Now, also what they're telling us, and this I really want to share with your viewers and you, the huge next 2 problems. Yeah, I have been begging on bended knees for every farmer in this country, every farmer I know I'm speaking to, please everybody in the coming season, grow food crop. Do not grow cash crop because you have a gigantic food crisis looming. Look at the fact, the Rabi crop, all the cash crops of the Rabi crop are lying unsold. Do you know that Maharashtra alone has 80 lakh quintals of cotton lying unsold with farmers or with the Cotton Corporation of India and the state government? Nationally, that's over 80 million quintals, and many of them are going to repeat cotton as a crop. Likewise, lakhs of tons of sugarcane are lying unsold, and people are going to repeat that crop because this is the market framework that they've been brainwashed into. Tell me, Manisha, with a worldwide crash in income, a worldwide crash in consumption, where are you going to sell your cotton? Who is going to buy your sugarcane? Who's going to buy the goddamn vanilla that you will produce from Kerala? Who's going to buy all these things? Now, you've got this next big problem is your 20 million people odd are going back. Then 9.1 million alone on the trains, okay? Now, apart from when those go back, the hunger issue increases. And you've got 80 million tons of food grain. And where have the media even discussed, they reported, where have they discussed, where have they made it a major issue that this government in mid-April, the government of India gave permission for the conversion of large stocks of food grain into ethanol to make hand sanitizer. Okay? And you know what will go for ethanol? Rice. So the southern and eastern states will be the worst affected. Yeah, you've got some 30 million tons of rice, which you call surplus. It's not a surplus, but it's there, buffer stock. Now, it's going to, you are destroying food, Manisha, to create hand sanitizer, which is the first priority for poor people on the edge. You're not distributing that rice in any significant way. Very minimal quantities of it have been distributed. You're sitting on it. Why are you sitting on it? Because you don't want prices to fall. If you release that rice out, prices will fall. You distribute it free, prices will fall. That's a market distortion that the market economists cannot accept, right? People dying is okay. It's not a market distortion. Now, what are you going to do to create jobs when people go back? Your NREGA, please remember that this government came to power. The first thing your leaders, the supreme leader said in parliament was that what a bogus scheme this rural employment guarantee scheme is. 2 years later, he claims to be having given the greatest allocations ever to it. The sincerity level, you judge for yourself. The NREGS has to be multiplied multifold. Where are the media looking at these issues? Lastly, the next big question. Many countries in the world, as you're aware now, are gearing up for the possibility of a second wave of the pandemic, a resurgence. Now, you know why you can't do that? You can't do that because it requires an unsparing look at what went wrong in the first round. Now, that means asking questions of your supreme leader. Tell me which sections of your media are going to do that in the mainstream.
On that very somber note, thank you so much for speaking to us. That was really nice. And I would urge all our viewers and subscribers to check out PARI. It has some great reporting. And thank you so much for taking out the time and speaking to us, and best of luck.
Pleasure. Pleasure, Manisha. Thank you.